Welcome to Scriptura's layer-by-layer overview of Psalm 3. Lord, how my adversaries have become many. Many are those saying about me, there's no victory for him in God. God won't save him. But you, Lord, are a shield for me. I will not be afraid of tens of thousands of people. In Psalm 3, David, the anointed king, describes the worst way someone has ever rebelled against him and betrayed him. His own son is trying to steal the throne and become king in his place. More and more people join his son and claim that God has abandoned David. And David must ask himself, is it true? Will God not save him ever again? But what tens of thousands of people are claiming only matters if it's true. The Lord is the one who makes people victorious, not great armies. He made a covenant with David, and he will be faithful to keep that covenant. So David does not need to fear. God fought for him in the past, and nothing has changed. God will still make him victorious, regardless of what tens of thousands of people claim. Victory only belongs to the Lord. A helpful way to remember this psalm is the phrase, victory is the Lord's, which means that the Lord decides who is victorious. This is the truth that corrects the lies David's enemies are telling. No matter how many enemies fight against David, they cannot change the truth that the Lord alone decides who is victorious. The superscription tells us this psalm was composed during the time when Absalom, David's son, was rebelling against David. Absalom had declared himself king and was trying to kill David, his father, whom he now saw as a rival. More and more people were joining with Absalom. David was in danger of losing everything: his friends, his kingdom, and even his life. In this context, he writes Psalm 3. We can divide the psalm itself into 3 sections. First, in verses 2 and 3, is the attack. In this section, David presents the situation to God, feeling thoroughly dismayed. He can see that more and more enemies are appearing, and he knows they're too powerful for him to fight on his own, especially since they're his own people who are now loyal to his son, not to him. They're abandoning him and claiming that God too has abandoned him. The worst way they attack him is by claiming that God will no longer make David victorious. In the second section, verses 4 to 7, is the defense. In the poetry, David argues against the enemies who attack him with their words. He defends himself in multiple parts. First, he declares that he still trusts God in verse 4. Then, in verse 5, he remembers what God has done in the past. Whenever David asked for help, the Lord always answered. The Lord always remembered his covenant with David, and history demonstrates his faithfulness. In verse 6, he remembers what had just happened the night before. Even though many enemies were looking for him to try to kill him, David slept without fearing danger because God was protecting him. The covenant has not changed. For all these reasons, David concludes that even if 10,000 enemies tried to fight him, he would still not need to be afraid. How many enemies there are does not matter. Only his covenant relationship with God matters. The section begins by showing David's confidence that God will save him, and ends with David feeling courageous enough to face his enemies, no matter how many they are. In the final section, victory, David corrects all the lies his enemies tell, and confidently tells the truth about victory. The Lord alone decides who wins, and he has decided for those in covenant with him. Victory belongs to the Lord and the Lord alone. David repeats the key words the enemies used to attack him. But this time, the meaning is the opposite. God rises up to respond to the enemies rising up. And God does make his covenant partner victorious. David's enemies thought God had abandoned him. But when David cries out for help, he feels triumphant, as if he has already won, because he knows the Lord will save him again, the way he has always saved him in the past. His son Absalom's treason does not decide whom God will save. God decides whom he will save. Victory belongs to the Lord alone, and the Lord will not abandon his king. This psalm begins as the psalmist is afraid and doesn't know what to do about the growing number of enemies. But because he remembers how many times God has saved him, he's confirmed in his covenant with God, and he feels confident, courageous, and even triumphant, because he knows God will make sure he is victorious again. David's enemies claimed God had abandoned him and he would never win again. David claims that the Lord is still his shield, just like in the past. According to the covenant, God would protect and defend him again. Even the night before, he slept peacefully, which shows that God was protecting David. As the psalmist thinks about his situation, he realizes he doesn't need to be afraid of his enemies. Even when so many enemies appear, he can't even count them. David can still trust God, who alone decides who receives the victory. He will be faithful to his covenant partner. Let's look at some background. The superscription for Psalm 3 introduces us to the terrible and sad situation that led David to write this psalm. It started when David sinned by sleeping with Bathsheba, the wife of one of his loyal men. She became pregnant with his child, and then he had her husband murdered in order to cover it up. A prophet of God told him that as consequence for this sin, God would bring violence to David's own household. The book of 2 Samuel describes Absalom's rebellion as God disciplining David for this sin. Absalom, David's third son, got people to rebel against his father and crown him the king in his father's place. Then he gathered the many people who had chosen to follow him in order to find his father and kill him. David told all the men still loyal to him that they had to flee from Jerusalem. If they tried to stay, their enemies would find them and kill them and the rest of the people in the city. David composed Psalm 3 in the context of running away from Absalom's men. David faces many problems in this psalm. The person attacking David is not a foreign king, but his own son. David also knows that God permitted this rebellion as a punishment for his sin. This is an incredibly painful situation for David, and it tests the strength of his covenant with the Lord. Just how loyal will the Lord be to David? Will the Lord discipline David by refusing to save him? The Lord's discipline may be one reason his enemies claim God had abandoned David. On the other hand, God had made a covenant with King David and promised to always be loyal to him. He promised that when David and his descendants sinned, he would discipline them, but he would never stop loving them or being loyal to them. This psalm is the battleground for these two competing claims. Will God's loyalty mean he still gives victory to David? Or will God's discipline mean he will no longer give victory to David? We'll now walk through the text in more detail, section by section.
A psalm by David when he was fleeing from Absalom, his son. Lord, how my adversaries have become many. Many are those rising against me. Many are those saying about me, there is no victory for him in God. Selah.
When David composed this psalm, he was worried about his son's armies attacking him. But in the psalm, he doesn't describe being attacked by soldiers and their weapons. He describes being attacked by his enemies' words. The key word repeated in the section is many. There are many adversaries, many people who attack him, many people who are claiming God has abandoned him. By repeating the word for many and placing it at the beginning of each of the first 3 clauses in Hebrew to emphasize it, David shows how overwhelmed he feels in this situation. The number of his enemies seems to keep growing. More and more enemies have surrounded him. We read the same in 2 Samuel 15, which tells of how the number of Absalom's followers, the people who rebelled against David, kept increasing. Some advice given to Absalom was to trust that the numbers would continue to grow. If he only waited a little longer, he would have as many followers as there were grains of sand on the seashore. David knew he was outnumbered. People who understood how to fight well with armies could see for themselves that Absalom had an advantage over his father, with Absalom's large number of followers. We understand why some people concluded that everything had changed, and even though God helped David win in the past, now there's no victory for David in God. They thought David's time as a powerful king, with God's protection, had ended. The Hebrew word for victory, which is often translated salvation in English, is a common word in the Psalms. Scholars say the idea of victory did not refer to being rescued, but instead to being successful, blessed, and protected because God is loyal and faithful. The idea of being victorious refers more to the state of being safe than it did about the actions, like winning a battle or escaping danger, those actions that made someone safe. In this psalm, one might also translate the word victory as security or protection. David's enemies were claiming that God would no longer keep David safe, that God would no longer protect him. It's easy to see why they were claiming this. All the evidence they saw could be interpreted as God having abandoned David. Absalom had persuaded the people to follow him and had gathered far more loyal followers than David had. Now, Absalom was chasing an old and weak king. It looked like God had abandoned David. David sees the same evidence, and he hears what they are saying. But he does not accept their conclusion before considering what he knows is true. He still has a covenant with the Lord.
But you, Lord, are a shield for me, my honor, and the one who lifts my head. I call aloud to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain, Selah. I lay down and fell asleep. I woke up because the Lord supports me. I will not be afraid of tens of thousands of people who have taken position against me all around.
David responds to the accusation very cleverly in the defense section, the second section. It begins with, "But you, Lord," which indicates a strong contrast. David is not going to agree with his enemy's claim that God had abandoned him. Many of the words in verse 3, when his many enemies attacked him, have sounds that repeat in verse 4. But the words they appear in have the opposite meanings. Instead of claiming that God would not protect David, David uses the same sounds to declare that the Lord is a shield for him, the source of his honor, and the one who gives him honor or lifts up his head. David responds to the claim that God would not protect him with his own statement. The Lord is his shield, which does protect him. His son's rebellion brought David shame temporarily, but the Lord grants and restores the honor he had lost. David lost respect in many people's eyes temporarily, but the Lord lifts his head, which means he restores David's position above others to a position that others highly respect. With these claims of his own, David answers his enemies' claims with a very different interpretation of the situation. He uses words that sound similar to his enemy's words, interpreting the same events, to declare how the Lord does protect David. This is a poetic way of rejecting their claim that God had abandoned David and replacing it with his own confident claim about who God is, his covenant partner who will still be loyal to David, a shield protecting him. This image of the Lord as a shield is important to the psalm. The Hebrew word, translated shield, referred to a flat object made of wood or metal that was usually round. A soldier used it in battle by holding it in front of him to protect himself from his enemy's swords or arrows. It was not too big, so it was easy to move around, and it was very necessary for soldiers to defend themselves when enemies attacked. David calls the Lord his shield, which means it is the Lord who will protect him from his enemies. That was the promise in the covenant. Shields could also be displayed in buildings, like temples or palaces, to display a kingdom's honor. The Lord is also David's honor, and the Lord, his shield, is a symbol of the victory and honor David will receive because the Lord protects him. Why does David trust in the Lord so confidently? Because he has known the Lord for a long time and learned his character regarding his covenant. Again and again, David called aloud to the Lord or asked for help during difficult times. Every time, the Lord answered or sent help from Zion, his holy mountain. Jerusalem, also called Mount Zion, was the place God chose for his temple, and it is often called his holy hill or holy mountain. Because his temple was there, it was where the people of earth encountered the God of heaven. It was where heaven and earth came together in a special way. When God sends help from Mount Zion, it is a way of saying he sends help from heaven to earth in accordance with the covenant established in Jerusalem, the covenant with King David. David knows the covenant. He knows the pattern. He knows the Lord is faithful to his covenant. And therefore, he knows he can depend on the Lord as long as the covenant lasts. Reminding himself of this pattern out loud is one of the ways he defends himself against the enemy's attacks. He replaces their lies about how the Lord will treat him now with the truth. How the Lord has always treated him in the past reveals his covenant loyalty. The Lord has always been loyal to his chosen king, and he promised he always will be. Because David knows the Lord, he can look at his difficult situation from a different perspective. He saw how bad the situation looked, but he also saw the context of his covenant with the Lord. In that light, things look very different. Though many enemies were fighting against him, the Lord has already been protecting him. Even the previous night, though people were searching for him and planning to kill him, he was able to lie down in peace, fall asleep, and wake up safe. Why? Because the Lord was supporting him. The fact he slept peacefully is evidence that the Lord is faithful and is still supporting David. This makes him feel more and more courageous. With the Lord as my protector, I will not be afraid of tens of thousands of armed people who have taken up positions all around me to harm me. With the Lord protecting me, I do not need to be afraid of anything. He is my shield, no matter how many enemies fight against me. He is the only shield I need in order to be fully protected. The covenant provided all the protection David needed. The Hebrew phrase for tens of thousands of people was used to mean very high numbers, and it's related to the words for many used in verses 2 and 3. It is not intended to mean a precise number. The idea is there were so many people that they couldn't even be counted. But even if more and more enemies keep coming to fight him, David won't feel afraid. He is protected.
Rise up, Lord, save me, my God, for you have struck all my enemies on the jaw. You have broken wicked people's teeth. Victory is the Lord's. Your blessing is on your people. Selah.
In the final section, David acts on his confidence that the Lord protects him. He prays to the Lord to save him and says, in triumph, that the Lord alone decides who wins. Victory belongs to the Lord alone, no matter what the enemies say. The section repeats several words from the first section of the psalm, very intentionally. Rising, victory, and God. In the first section, his enemies, rising against David to attack, had claimed God would not give David victory. Just like David repeated the same sounds his enemy used in verse 4 to claim that the opposite of what they said was true. Now, he repeats the same words used by his enemies when he asks God to save him. He calls on the Lord to rise up, fight against the enemies. He calls out, "Save me, my God," as a way of reversing their claim that God would not save him. God will prove himself faithful and will still save him. In the past, David faced many enemies. When he did, God struck all his enemies on the jaw. He broke wicked people's teeth, which means God publicly humiliated them and made them so weak they could not chase or hurt David anymore. The Hebrew sounds in these phrases are sharp and rough sounds, like the sound of punching someone in the jaw and breaking their teeth. This is the climax of the psalm. David started the psalm feeling afraid, but now he feels confident and courageous. He knows that God will protect him and give him victory, humiliating and defeating his enemies, just as he has done so many times in the past. That same root for save in verse 8 returns as a noun in verse 9. Victory is the Lord's. This is what a warrior might yell as he goes to fight a battle, because he knows the Lord has given him victory in the past and will continue to determine every victory. David is like a warrior celebrating victory even before he fights, because he knows he cannot lose. He can declare that he has won even before he sees the result of the battle, because he knows that the Lord will save his own. His own means his own people. God blesses his own people, not his enemies' people. This is the result of David's argument that defends himself against his enemies' lies. David is the king God chose, and God's own people are those who are loyal to David, not those who are loyal to David's rebellious son, who has rejected his father. Since God chose David, he will bless David and everyone who is loyal to him. David's people are God's people, so God will protect and bless David's people, giving them the victory. David composed Psalm 3 while preparing to fight, so he was truly in danger of being killed in a battle. But the psalm describes a battle in David's mind between feeling fear and confidence. David understands how difficult the situation is. More and more enemies are appearing and claiming that God will no longer save him. But David also knows how God has treated him in the past. He knows God will keep his covenant, and he has promised to never stop loving David. He understands the past, and he remembers God has always protected him and enabled him to succeed when his enemies threatened him. Poetically, David takes apart the words his enemies use to attack him and replaces them with a new meaning. He does this first when he defends himself. God is his shield. God has always protected him. Then, David responds to his enemies' lies with his own way of attacking. He calls out to God to save him, knowing that God has promised to protect him and that he will always save him. He even shouts in triumph, as if he has already won the fight, because he knows that victory belongs to the Lord alone. The enemy's attack falls apart in several poetic ways. David describes his enemies as many 3 times, as if he's trying to count them and there are too many to count. But once David focuses on God, he's able to say he will not be afraid even if tens of thousands of enemies came against him. It doesn't matter how many enemies there are. The enemies claimed God had abandoned David, but David tests that against history. He remembers that God has never abandoned him, which gives him confidence to call on God to do something his enemies think is impossible. He calls on God to save him once again. If the enemies thought God had abandoned David, they probably thought God would bless them instead. David corrects this idea as well. God will still bless him and those who are loyal to him, but not those who reject him as God's chosen king. This completes our section-by-section walkthrough of Psalm 3. We'll finish now with a reading of the text that brings everything together.
A psalm by David when he was fleeing from Absalom, his son. Lord, how my adversaries have become many. Many are those rising against me. Many are those saying about me, there is no victory for him in God. Selah. But you, Lord, are a shield for me, my honor, and the one who lifts my head. I call aloud to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain. Selah. I lay down and fell asleep. I woke up because the Lord supports me. I will not be afraid of tens of thousands of people who have taken up position against me all around. Rise up, Lord, save me, my God, for you have struck all my enemies on the jaw. You have broken wicked people's teeth. Victory is the Lord's. Your blessing is on your people. Selah.